All right. So I haven't done this in a year. Um, Obviously, things have changed in Facebook, and I'm finding that out to my detriment now. What my intention was to do a bunch of tests earlier today, and then I wouldn't have to do what I did last year, which was come on here and sit around and go, "Can anyone hear me? Can anyone hear me? Can anyone hear me?" Until somebody in the chat responds with, "Yes, we can hear you." Um, and that was sort of the way it went last year. And I thought this year it'd be a lot easier because I've had so much experience. But no, I've been futzing around with different kinds of gear, and I did a test earlier, obviously, and I got some feedback from good old Sean Gaylord, one of the best sound engineers of live music in Seattle, and said it was a pretty low volume affair. I went to do some research in the last 45 minutes, found out that that's pretty typical for Facebook live streaming. I decided this time to not go with OBS or live YouTube and try out the Facebook Live platform because surely they would have improved it since last year. Well, apparently not because the audio is low. And hey, Sean, thank you for being here. And the options to get around that have been removed. The YouTube tutorials I just checked out in the last 45 minutes to make your audio sound better and remove the restrictions they put on you, those controls are gone now. So if Sean can hear me and I'm not distorting, I guess I'm okay for now. I mean, I can't monitor it, I think, unless, I mean, I used to last year, but it's just not working. I'll figure it out. I'm going to go back to OBS after this. This was an exciting experiment to try. In the meanwhile, let me check the event page itself. I think I was hoping there we go. I'm going to grab a link to this video and put it in my main feed because it's sort of a compromise. You can set up an event and invite people, but then it won't automatically post that live feed from the event to your main page. Let's see if this works. Thank you for being here for all the preliminaries. Those of you that aren't currently embroiled in footballery, although I understand football is great. I like it a lot. Oh, for crying out loud. It's just posting the URL, but not the video. Great. Live video happening here. Simpsons. Boop. Hi, Karen. Oh, welcome. Sounds great, just low. Thank you, Sean. Okay, well, what I'm going to do is get on with it. When I'm done with this video and I download it, then I will drop it into some production software, adjust the volume levels, adjust the EQ. I went through my old mixer that I was using last year and then put that through the interface to brighten up the EQ a bit. I'm going to crank the gain a little. Well, that's getting in the red on the interface. So that's probably as far as I should go before it starts distorting. But I will turn up the high end on the EQ a little bit. So maybe there'll be more clarity. Now, hopefully that doesn't just translate into more mouth sounds coming through, which is gross. Who wants that? All right. So I missed doing this. It was a lot of fun last year. At Karen Christopher's suggestion, I may also get into some Wizard of Oz books because they're pretty fascinating and scary and fun. But I wanted to revisit a book that I read, about a couple years ago, An Unauthorized, Uncensored History of the Simpsons by John Ortved. I'm not going to read it, word for word. I'm going to start with the introduction and read the first couple pages of that, and I'm going to jump to the next couple of chapters. Let's see. And still on my live feed, on my page, one last check. Yeah, it's not posting the video. All right, good to know. But we are live in the event itself. Okay, cool. Still clear. Okay, good. Thank you, Sean. It's nice to have a good sound engineer as your friend when you're doing things like this. All right. Let me mess with the windows here so I'm not seeing too much of the same thing. I want you all to know I wore my good socks for you today. Those are my good socks. Ah. In way worse shape than I was this time last year, so I can't lift them up like a rocket like I used to. All right, introduction. I can't do back. It's like backing up a trailer. There it is. Hi, everybody. Hi, Dr. Nick. Here we go. Oh, I just realized my window's open. My neighbors can hear me. Or the birds can hear me. In August 1992, at the Republican National Convention in Houston, George Herbert Walker Bush made a commitment to strengthen traditional values, promising to make families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons. A few days later, before the opening credits rolled on the sitcom's weekly episode, so within that week, less than a week, The Simpsons issued its response. Seated in front of the television, the family watched Bush's remarks. Hey, we're just like the Waltons, said Bart. We're praying for an end to the Depression, too. While the immediacy of the response was unique, it was vintage Simpsons, tongue-in-cheek, subversive satire, skewering both the president's cartoonish political antics and the culture that embraced them. 5 months later, Bill Clinton moved in the White House. The Waltons were out. The Simpsons were in. Back in the late 80s, when The Simpsons premiered on Fox, comedically speaking, primetime television was somewhat lacking. Despite some bright spots like Cheers and the cheerfully crude Roseanne, the sitcom roost was ruled by didactic, saccharine family fare. The Cosby Show, Full House, Growing Pains, Golden Girls, Family Ties. I wouldn't put Golden Girls in there myself, obviously. Last year, I went live and read a book about the Golden Girls. Callback. Family Ties and Family Matters. Of the latter, Tom Shales piously declared in the Washington Post, a decent human being would have a hard time not smiling. It was on this sad entertainment landscape that in December of 1989, The Simpsons launched its offensive. Prime time had not seen an animated sitcom since The Flintstones, and that's a point worth making more than once. This is prime time family sitcom. The Flintstones, a lot of us grew up with as a kid's cartoon that was played on the afternoons when we got out of school. Well, maybe you didn't grow up in Yakima, but that was as new as our cartoons got back in 1981. But it was a sitcom. It was played for family viewing in the evening, the Flintstones, and it was incredibly successful. But this is the first time that's happened in history since then. And the Christmas special that debuted the series made clear that Springfield and Bedrock were separated by more than just a few millennia. Couldn't be better. Not only exquisitely weird, but also as smart and witty as television gets, raved the LA Times. Why would anyone want to go back to Growing Pains, asked USA Today. They were neither human beings nor the least bit decent, but the rich characters, subversive themes, and layered humor resounded deeply with both child and adult audiences, demanding more from their entertainment. What followed is one of the most astounding successes in television history. The Simpsons went on to be a ratings and syndication winner for 20 years and has grossed sums of money measuring in the billions for Fox. It has garnered 23 Emmys and a Peabody Award, and it beat out Mary Tyler Moore, Seinfeld, and the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite to be named Time Magazine's best television series of all time. Dazzlingly intelligent and unapologetically vulgar, The Simpsons have surpassed the humor, topicality, and yes, humanity of past TV greats. Blah, 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 blah. Such lofty significance was never the goal of Matt Groening, who, with writing aspirations, moved to Los Angeles in 1977, immersing himself in the punk rock scene and working stiff jobs to pay the rent. He recorded his disgust with LA in the comic strip Life in Hell, which transposed Groening's dissatisfaction, beefs, and whimsical cynicism into the thoughts and speeches of a wordy, deeply cynical, one-eared rabbit named Binky, his illegitimate son, Bongo, and a gay couple who may or may not be identical twins named Jeff and Akbar. It found its way into the LA Reader and then LA Weekly, and in 1986 caught the attention of James L. Brooks, legendary writer-producer of Taxi and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and writer and director of Terms of Endearment. Brooks was looking for a cartoon short to place before commercials on The Tracy Ullman Show, which he was producing at the behest of Barry Diller for the struggling Fox network. Imagine that phrase now. Struggling Fox network. Groening came up with an idea. That's my note, not the book's note. With an idea for a cartoon family based on his own called The Simpsons. Fox was the new kid on the block and was taking daily beatings in the ratings. Rupert Murdoch had successfully wooed Diller to Fox in 1986, and he'd bet on the right pony. Diller launched some of television's first reality programming, Cops and America's Most Wanted, while taking the sitcom in lewd new directions with Married with Children. While Fox lost approximately $50 million its first year, it caught a break in 1988 when the writers in Hollywood went on strike, forcing the major networks who were bound to the union to play reruns against first-run shows on the union-free Fox. The network began turning a profit, but Diller still didn't have his monster hit. When Brooks approached him with the idea of making The Simpsons into its own series, Diller bit. It's not often I've had the experience of watching something great and praying the next minute doesn't dash it, Diller told Newsweek. And not only having that not happen, but saying at the end, this is the real thing. This is the one that can crack the slab for us. When it premiered, the show was both a hit and a lightning rod for criticism. Principals around the country banned Bart Simpson t-shirts with their slogan, underachiever and proud of it. I remember that. That happened. That happened at Shadow Lake, or would have been Cedar River Elementary School at the time in South King County. I mean, it happened at a lot of schools, but conservatives bristled at a cartoon family portraying such dysfunction and distrust of institutions. Police, church, teachers, all are suspect in Springfield. Actually, yeah, I was in 5th grade when a kid had the t-shirt that said the nuclear family on the back, and it had a picture of the family in the living room, just all randomly, like, not interacting with each other and doing weird stuff. But that was 89. Yeah, so the show had started by then. I'm glad you were all here for that, when me figuring that out. Zach Jarvis had that shirt. Let's see. Oh, yes. Living under the shadow of a dangerous nuclear power plant, Barbara Bush called it the dumbest thing I have ever seen. After Marge Simpson wrote her a letter, she apologized. But the Bushes missed the bus. By the summer of 1990, the Simpsons were everywhere. It was Bart mania. America had fallen in love with Homer, Lisa, Marge, Maggie, but especially the spiky-haired, underachieving, authority-challenging Bart. He made the cover of Time, Newsweek, and Rolling Stone. Fox struck a deal with Mattel, and talking Bart dolls became disappearing from department store shelves. Bart Simpson t-shirts were selling at the rate of 1 million per day in North America. His catchphrases like, I'm Bart Simpson, who the hell are you? And don't have a cow, man, became such staples of early 90s lexicon that their overuse would eventually be parodied in the show. All right, goes on and on and on. I'm going to skip past the rest of the introduction. And then we get into Matt Groening's origin story, him being a kid, blah, blah, blah. He went to Evergreen State College in Washington. And let's see. I'm going to flip past some of that and get to a little bit more of the action here. In 1977, a freshly graduated 23-year-old Groening headed to Los Angeles. He lived with his girlfriend, Linda Weinman, worked on his writing, and paid the rent with a series of dead-end jobs. Matt's initiation to LA was, in a word, hellish. As he later told Playboy, life in hell was inspired by my move to Los Angeles in 1977. I got here on a Friday night in August, and it was about 102 degrees. My car broke down in the fast lane of the Hollywood freeway while I was listening to a drunken DJ who was giving his last program on a local rock station and bitterly denouncing the station's management. And then I had a series of lousy jobs. These included being a writer, chauffeur to an ancient director, writing slogans for horror movies at an ad agency, landscaping at a sewage treatment plant, and working at a copy shop. His interest in music drew him to the punk scene, and he got a job at the Whiskey A Go-Go, where he got to wait on Elvis Costello, as well as Licorice Pizza, the record shop across the street. In addition to selling records, Licorice Pizza also sold drug paraphernalia, including Coke vials. Because the store sold the caps separately from the vials, Matt would have to count them out one by one. It was great fun for him to take his time counting out hundreds of Coke vials while the customer, ramped up on cocaine, waited impatiently. At this point, Groening was already drawing Life in Hell, which he photocopied and sent to his friends or sold for $2 a pop at Licorice Pizza. Groening attacked the institutions the angsty 20-somethings found most repellent and conformist: school, work, and love. A typical strip asked, "Is there a life in hell philosophy?" The answers were as follows: "Your days are numbered. It's later than you think. We are all doomed. Have a nice day." Originally, Binky the Bunny, Groening's mouthpiece, was condescending and preachy, but Groening altered him to be more of a victim, with forces working against him, like Reaganite social values, the religious right, commercialism, teachers, and bosses. The cartoons reeked of depression, death, and fear, but there was fun to be had. Ironies and insights in the commentary that people related to. A classic strip has Binky bound and gagged in an empty room. Two eyes peer through a slit in the room's only door, and a menacing voice intones, "Are you ready to embrace family values yet?" Matt Groening to the Portland Oregonian, March 25th, 1990. The more horrible things I did to that rabbit, the more people liked it. I think there's a parallel there with Judge Dredd, the British science fiction comic strip with a fascistic cop that never wavers from the law and just brutally punishes people for the smallest offenses, like hoarding sugar in a small jar that they're not legally allowed to have in their kitchen. Everyone that disagrees with those values loves watching them being taken out to the extreme. Anyway, today, Life in Hell is let's see. Nah, who cares? Who cares? Who cares? Let me jump ahead to, let's see, James Vowell, editor-in-chief of the LA Reader. I was the founding editor of the LA Reader back in '78. Very shortly after we got the first issue out, maybe in the next week or two, Matt called me, probably in November of '78. He was looking for writing and editing jobs in LA, and we just got to talking. Gene Levine, former publisher. Matt came in with these silly cartoons with rabbits with one ear and showed them to James. I was the publisher. I was the money person. James was the editor. Matt leaves. James comes in the office and says, "This guy is going to be famous someday." And I look at these flipping rabbits, and go, "Whatever, James." But I've since learned that James was right about a lot of people, not only Matt. James Vowell. The first story of his that got published was in something like February 9th or 10th, 1979. It was a very interesting story about how people put signs up on Sunset Boulevard and how they painted them. He covered the whole scene. He kept doing minor assignments over the next few months, and then the publisher hired Matt as our distribution manager. Free newspapers, you have to go out and find places to put the racks. You have to make deals with merchants. So he ran around LA, did some of the delivery himself. He was a full-time employee, writing more features. Very shortly after that, maybe within 6 months or so, I was able to convince Jane Levine to let him be my assistant editor. He was my assistant editor at the LA Reader for 2 or 3 years. So this, if I'm not, putting too fine a point on it, is how a very subversive, artistic, free spirit that it is terrified of having to work like 5, low-paying jobs a week gets the discipline to understand how the scheduling of a publishing company would work, or, let's say publishing something like a television program. Let's see. And also it gave him an income, a forum for his writing, and an official entree into the underground and music and art scenes. It's true, Mark. Thank you for joining, Mark. All the way from Bellingham, Mark Thompson, ladies and gentlemen. Gary Gantner. Punk rock was happening, so there were shows all the time. And me and Matt, everybody went to these shows, and a lot of the same bands would play. They became very famous, and it was really creative. Punk rock in LA was a lot of people out of art school doing creative things, making publications and clothing and music and so on. We were part of that. And the idea that we could get things into the LA Reader and then have them being blown down the street weeks later seemed like some sort of an interesting accomplishment to impact the landscape somehow. And I think Matt and I were both interested in doing that. We were both interested in entering into culture somehow. It's interesting if the individual can have an effect in culture. That's an interesting problem. Matt fell in love with a punk scene that was blooming in LA. He reviewed unknown bands in the Reader. Then, a week after the review had been published, he would check in with a record store, only to find they hadn't sold a single copy. So, Matt told NPR, I wasn't that good as a rock critic. Jane Levine, oh God, the LA Reader was so cool. It was an alternative weekly, as if the Village Voice had a baby. It was very small, but it always had incredibly high standards of literary journalism. And these are such difficult words: hipness and alternativeness. In 78, the calendar section of the LA Times was an amazing fat arts and entertainment section, but the line hadn't blurred between mainstream and alternative journalism to the extent that it has now. So when we wrote about punk rock in Chinatown, it wasn't something that everybody was writing about. And we wrote about the city, a place to live, and not about the industry. And James Vowell collected this amazing group of writers and illustrators like Matt, but also like Gary Panter, Steve Erickson, the crazy Richard Meltzer, Richard Gere. These are not names I've ever heard. Gehr, not Gere. These really, really great writers. Anyway, talking more about that crew, spinning ahead. Let me just go into. He was a fun guy to work with. He explained to me what a joke is. A joke is what somebody doesn't expect. Tuesday night, we'd go up to Hollywood, where the typesetter had his operation, and pick up stuff to proof. Often we'd get hungry and went off to have supper and proofread. Matt was always trying to sell Life in Hell as an idea to me for a weekly cartoon in the paper. And he'd draw these little pictures on paper napkins, just ballpoint pen stuff. Occasionally, I would say, Matt, why don't you make the chin a little smaller? And I was trying to edit his cartoons, but he didn't need me to edit his cartoons, I guarantee you. In April 1980, we published the first weekly newspaper version of Life in Hell. Gary Panter. Matt's earliest comics were about language. That was the major theme in his early mini comics. I think it went into Life in Hell. He did a whole series of Life in Hell called Forbidden Words before I met him. I thought, oh, this guy seems very critical and tough, because he would just name all these words that were overused in culture and forbid them from being used again. This included ambiance, bummer, and boogie. Now, fast forward to today, when in social media, every 6 months, there's a repost of a repost of a repost of a words to stop using, phrases to stop using, because they've been so burned out for 3 months of everyone overusing them. I myself am obviously guilty of that just a couple of posts ago with the read that again. So Matt was trying to do that in print to the LA readership to stop them from saying these things out loud. Let's see. Deborah Graining, Matt's ex-wife. I came to the Reader in 1981, got a job as a sales rep. One of the things I discovered was that Matt's cartoon was a major selling point when I was going around town. My beat was Melrose, which at the time was where all the fashion, music, sort of hip street. I would look through the archives and bring the coolest issues, including the one that Matt wrote, a cover story called Hipness and Stupidity. When I met Matt, he was in Valentino Place, formerly Mary Pickford's apartment building, next to Paramount Studios, in a really seedy part of Hollywood. His neighborhood was so bad that Deborah would not visit after dark. I mean, he was hunting for quarters in his ugly orange shag carpeting. He had checks, $10, $15 checks that were like 3 years old from some paper somewhere. So we made an amazing team, you know, because I really appreciated the artistic aesthetic. But I had a natural instinct for business, so it was really kind of an amazing ride for around 10 years. So he's picking up steam there. Blah, blah, blah. He likes Frank Zappa. He makes friends, yada, 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 yada. Deborah keeps him afloat for a while. This is a great book you should read on your own if you care about The Simpsons. I'm not going to just read every single page because I want to get into, let's just sort of say things pick up pretty well. Because the main reason I'm going into this Life in Hell stuff is because he makes a really good deal to get this sort of developed into a bigger property. And that's what sort of ties his hands when he gets an offer to do a TV show that becomes The Simpsons. He created The Simpsons because Life in Hell got strangled by some other entertainment company, and he couldn't use that instead, which is what he wanted to do. Let's see. Deborah Graining. Meanwhile, things were happening right and left. Finally, in '86, Matt got into the Village Voice. which was a huge goal of his. So his comic strip got in. And we got into more and more papers. We ended up being in 200 newspapers. Now it's more than 250 that all had from 50,000 to 500,000 readership. So there were literally millions of fans. And we had these rep networks. We negotiated to retain the non-book rights. So we had gift stores, novelty stores, comic book stores. And it was amazing when I got the call from Pantheon. Then he was asked to do a computer drawing, a poster for Apple computers, and it was just really exciting. Maneuvering to ensure they retained the rights to Life in Hell merchandise was a smart and practical move. But more important, it was a decision that would foreshadow the Groening's insistence when the Simpsons came along that they do the same thing. Deborah, when we started getting requests to license on other things like calendars and so forth, and then we did a line of greeting cards for paper and graphics, which was a groovy card company at the time, we were really diversifying. Between Groening's creativity and Kaplan's industriousness, they had managed to create a Life in Hell cottage industry. They moved to Venice Beach, and there was no more digging in the carpets for spare change. Matt and Deborah would marry in 1987, handing over the management of their business to Pantheon, part of Random House. In 89, when Deborah became pregnant with their first child, that was the end of that sentence. Their union would last until 1999. So, like his first wife, I left Matt Groening and The Simpsons after 10 years of that show as well. But then again, I jumped over to Futurama. When Deborah would file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, she retained custody of their two children, Homer and Abe. She had become a licensed therapist and is using her considerable means to build a foundation for troubled families. James Val, I actually wrote the original business plan for Matt's publishing operation probably in 88 or 89. I still have a copy of it on my bookshelf at home. He was just trying to raise a little money to expand his operations. And on the last page of the business plan, it talks about how this may not go forward because Matt is talking with people at Fox Television about doing some cartoons for the Tracy Ullman Show. There's our setup. How's everybody doing? I'm getting dry. Okay. Let's see if I've missed out on anything. Oh, man. Martin Reed, thank you for joining. All right. Chapter 2, The King of Comedy, in which we meet James L. Brooks. Stalin, Hitler, and Rupert Murdoch, a billionaire tyrant, is mocked by Brandon Tartikoff. James Brooks establishes Yado in La La Land, and the real Waylon Smithers is universally feared and mocked. If he were a little dumber, he'd be a lot happier. Shirley MacLaine. In 1987, as much as it was anyone's, Hollywood belonged to James L. Brooks. An unprecedented string of successes writing and producing for television in the 70s and 80s that included, get ready for this, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Rhoda, Lou Grant, and Taxi had proved he was a force. In terms of endearment in 1983, which he produced, wrote, and directed, taking Oscars for each one, had made him a juggernaut. In 87, he cemented his position among Hollywood's elite with Broadcast News, starring longtime friend and collaborator Albert Brooks, another smash hit with critics and at the box office. Brooks's ability to take the foibles, neuroses, and failings that make us human and translate them into believable and beloved characters on the big screen would continue to entrance moviegoers with Big, The War of the Roses, Say Anything, all of which he produced before the 80s were done. Whereas his sitcoms had projected heart and wit, his ability in films to draw laughter from the most tragic and awkward moments and to infuse humor with the most dramatic poignancy earned him the nickname the Dark Prince of Comedy. And yet, while his film career was rocketing forward in 1987, it was the Tracy Ullman Show, a television program he was producing for Fox, that Brooks would lend his genius to a dysfunctional cartoon family who more than anything would make his fortune, his name, and his legacy. Gavin Polone, former agent for Conan O'Brien, Simpsons writers, executive producer, Curb Your Enthusiasm. He was the very top of the ladder. And in a weird way, he was probably the writer held in the greatest respect back in the late 80s. He still had that track record that he had going back through Mary Tyler Moore and all the other shows he had done. But keep in mind that he was at the pinnacle of his movie career, too. I would just say, in terms of the people behind the camera of movies and TV at that time, he was not only the most successful, but the most respected. Let's see. James L. Brooks' origin story, growing up, going to NYU, blah, 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 blah. Got a job as a page at CBS in 64 at the age of 24. He got a job writing for the Nightly News. 2 years later, he was in LA selling scripts to the Andy Griffith Show. My Mother the Car and That Girl. A friend of Brooks intimated that during his earlier, leaner years in Hollywood, in meetings with executives, he would employ a strategy so quirky that it seems like it's right out of one of his films. When Brooks entered a meeting, he would deliberately hurt himself physically, banging into a table or a chair, immediately winning sympathy and gaining what he saw as the upper hand. In 1969, he created a dramatic comedy set in a high school called Room 222, which won him an Emmy. That year, he also partnered with fellow TV writer Ed Burns, creating the sitcom The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which became one of the most acclaimed TV shows of all time, inspiring several Brooks-produced spin-offs, including Rhoda, Lou Grant. And in 1978, he moved on to something slightly edgier, creating Taxi, a sitcom about small-time New York cabbies, starring Judd Hirsch, Tony Danza, Danny DeVito, Christopher Lloyd, and Andy Kaufman. The idea for the show supposedly came from a 1975 article in New York Magazine, passed on to Brooks by his best friend, Jerry Belson. Ken Eston, producer Taxi, The Tracy Ullman Show. We would have a room full of writers, very expensive writers, and the best in the business, because it was Taxi. And Taxi at the time was the top show on TV. And the scene wasn't working, and Jim just dictated an entire scene himself, and nobody even butted in because he was on a roll. I've never seen anybody do that. Judd Hirsch, actor, Taxi, he would go further than anybody. He would think of the most embarrassing situation you could imagine in human life and allow it to happen on stage. He would dare to write it. Ken Eston. He seems to think in ways nobody else thinks. Most of us have to sit down and take a long time to put our thoughts together. When I was running Taxi, I would spend a long time coming up with story ideas for the coming episodes, and if I'd go to Jim and pitch the idea, he'd think about it for a second and suddenly have the way to go with it. It's like he had a sixth sense about situation comedy. Jim used to be able to do it, like Mozart did music, I guess. I remember one episode we wrote, Ed Weinberger didn't like it at all, that's the producer of the show, made us rewrite the whole thing. And then Jim Brooks got a copy of the script and called up and said it was perfect the way it was. And even Ed, who had great credits and confidence, immediately reneged on his objections and said, go back to the original script. People just felt that way about Jim Brooks. Gary Ross. I think within a comic structure, he investigated the nooks and crannies of character. He's relentless in examining all the nuances of that character and being incredibly thorough. It's never glib. He inhabits and completely investigates a world. It's very much about the examination of human behavior. And to him, the nuance of the subtlety of human behavior is the movie moment, so to speak. Brooks was a brilliant writer, but he also had his mercurial side. Mercurial in rock and roll journalism and entertainment journalism is a code word for being really unpredictable and hard to deal with for people that like to keep things on schedule or on an even keel emotionally. Aha. Mark's having laundry time fun. Good. Fold your underpants to me speaking. Karen, enjoy some tea. I have lots of good tea in my life right now I should talk to you about soon. Martin, I hope things are going good musically. I hope this 3-day weekend for you, Martin, is very creative. I hope you get to jam. Let's see. Let me go back to Mercurial. Sorry. Um, People who work with him note that although he could be magnanimous, he was also sometimes difficult, narcissistic, and demanding, both on the set and off. Along with being brilliant, funny, and playful, he is often described as uncompromising, misanthropic, and fatalistic. The glass was never full, one longtime friend of Brooks told me. It was always half empty. And it was always less than half empty. The world was always ending. Anne Spielberg, co-writer of the movie Big. He is very generous with his time. He really listens. He has a temper that I think explodes if he feels someone isn't living up to what they should be doing. He made me feel alternately very talented and very stupid. Ken Eston. He was crazy. Sometimes he's very depressed and sometimes he's very excited. I don't know if he was a manic depressive, but he seemed to have his swings. Sometimes he'd get angry. One time when I was brand new at running the show, David Lloyd wrote a script. Lloyd had written for the Dick Cavett show back in the day and was writing a colleague of Brooks's and Weinberger's from Mary Tyler Moore and its spin-offs, but was not a staff writer on Taxi at the time. Ed Weinberger told us because of David's years of success and his brilliance, don't change anything because he doesn't like the idea that you young guys are going to fool around with his work. Well, when we brought it to the table for the table reading, it didn't work very well, and Jim Brooks, in front of the actors and the director and everybody, started screaming at me that I should have been ashamed to bring a script like this to the table, that I shouldn't call myself a producer. He just chewed the hell out of me in front of everybody, yelling at me. Yelling, not talking. That's the kind of thing he would do, and he never waited to hear the explanation. I have enormous respect for him as a writer. As a person, he's a little messed up. But maybe that's because he's a genius. Maybe geniuses are messed up. I don't know. Jim didn't yell a lot. By the time Taxi finished in 1983, Brooks had moved on to film, taking with him 9 Emmys and 2 Peabody Awards. And these were just the awards Brooks himself received. Collectively, his sitcoms earned 60 Emmys. While there were a few failures, like 1978's Cindy, as well as a lawyer drama he concocted in 79 called The Associates, they had barely blemished his resume. His reputation in 83 was strong enough for Paramount to let him write, direct, and produce his own feature, a film based on Larry McMurtry. Whoa! Sorry. I didn't realize Larry McMurtry wrote Terms of Endearment. The guy that wrote, like Lonesome Dove, I think. Right? That's the Larry McMurtry we're talking about. In terms of the story of a domineering mother's relationship with her free-spirited daughter, Polly Platt. Jim really didn't know how to direct when he did Terms of Endearment. He didn't understand a lot about camera and technicalities of it, but he knew what he wanted and he knew what he wanted to see. All right, here we go. Cutting in with Albert Brooks. Albert Brooks has compared the risks taken in acting to jumping without a net. Working under Jim Brooks's direction allowed him to take any risk because he was certain that his best work would end up on the screen. In 1986, with help from 20th Century Fox, Brooks created his own production company, Gracie Films, named after the comedian Gracie Allen. Brooks established Gracie to provide real writers with a vehicle to get their movies made. As a filmmaker, Brooks was famous for undertaking a Herculean amount of research, casting, shooting, editing, and reshooting. Using the best actors, he would still do 20, sometimes 25 takes for a single scene. This drive for perfection and strain for independence would underpin the early years of The Simpsons. Much of The Simpsons' success can be traced to 2 main sources. This is why I'm giving all this backstory and not skipping over it. An independence from network interference and a complete dedication to the writing, no matter how many drafts or how expensive that process became. In its early years, Gracie produced Big, written by Anne Spielberg and Gary Ross, and directed by Penny Marshall. Penny Marshall from a million other directing jobs, but you might remember her as Laverne on Laverne and Shirley, beginning of her TV acting success. The War of the Roses, written by Michael Leeson and directed by Danny DeVito, which also stars Danny DeVito. Say Anything, written and directed by Cameron Crowe. And if you've listened to my podcast, you know all kinds of stuff about that guy, and we're going to get into more of it soon. Later, Gracie was the company behind Riding in Cars with Boys, Jerry Maguire, and Bottle Rocket. Meanwhile, Brooks wrote, directed, and produced As Good as It Gets, and less acclaimed films I'll Do Anything and Spanglish. Okay. I feel like I can skip ahead a little bit. Let's get up to Rupert Murdoch purchases 20th Century Fox. Let's see. Let's see. Let me. Yeah, he'd been writing Jim's coattails for a long time. There's a guy named Richard Sakai. If Sakai was the guy beneath Jim Brooks, providing the means to Jim's ends, Barry Diller was the guy above. Diller was at the helm of Fox when Brooks bought the Tracy Ullman Show to the network. A legendary Hollywood executive turned mogul, Diller had invented the made-for-TV movie. Oh my gosh. Okay. He invented the made-for-TV movie at ABC in the 70s and knew Brooks well from Paramount, where Diller had been CEO and overseen the production of Taxi and Terms of Endearment, as well as other monster hits like Cheers, Indiana Jones, Saturday Night Fever, and Grease. I can't remember what it was now, but I know there's a movie or a TV show joke about someone being pointed out as like, you're the guy that invented the made-for-TV movie or something like that. Or oh no, I'm thinking of Scrooged. You're the guy that created the the guy that invented the miniseries. I don't know, maybe it's just an inside joke. Thank you, Karen. He wrote Lonesome Dove. Perfect. By the way, if you watch the first 15 minutes of Lonesome Dove, the TV show, try and tell me that Robert Duvall in those scenes is somehow not the spitting image and vocal delivery of Matthew McConaughey. It's crazy. He seems like he should be Matthew McConaughey's dad. I won't be surprised if there was a DNA test. And that's what comes out of it. In 78, Diller took steps to create a fourth major television network. So here's the other important sort of part of this process. There's three major networks. There's no way in hell that something like the Tracy Ullman Show or Married with Children or The Simpsons is going to be on those. Going back to our introduction about what was actually populating the landscape at the time, he tried to create Paramount Television Service to compete with the big three. The idea quickly crumbled. The network was to be launched on the strength of a follow-up series to Star Trek called Star Trek Phase 2, no joke. This misstep aside, Diller was a TV visionary, and the natural choice to run a new network when in 85, Australian billionaire Rupert Murdoch purchased 20th Century Fox, the legendary studio of Daryl Zanuck from oil wildcatter Marvin Davis. While Diller and Brooks are old friends, their relationship was described to me as complicated and at times combative. Fitting with his personality, Jim Brooks likes to feel that he, as another producer put it, Joe Lunchbox, an employee with a boss with whom he resents, can rebel against, a role easily provided by the domineering Diller and his control of the purse strings at Paramount and Fox. Conversely, it seems that Jim's tendency to break new ground pushed Diller to explore unique creative opportunities. Okay, more intrigue there. I'm going to skip ahead. It's a bunch of, TV executives doing their thing. Fox Broadcasting's first foray into entertainment was in October of 86 with The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. If any of you here are students of the late night talk show wars, you know how that's going to go. Joan Rivers was a sometimes guest host on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And when he decided to hand off the show to Jay Leno, it was pretty clear that various other, previous guest hosts were not going to get that gig. But well before that actually happened, Joan Rivers kind of got the bad news from either Johnny or from the folks at The Tonight Show that when the time comes, when Johnny in a few years is going to retire in like 1990 or whatever it is, he's got his eye on Jay instead of you, at least for now. So instead of waiting until Johnny was going to retire, she decided to make a deal with Fox and do her own thing on her own show. So let's see. Late Show starring Joan Rivers intended to compete with Johnny Carson and David Letterman. Rivers was a big name yet edgy star the network was banking on to draw hip young audiences. But she failed miserably, fought with executives, and was replaced after less than a year. Footnote. Rivers, who had been Johnny Carson's permanent guest host since '83, had deeply offended and alienated Carson by taking the job. Oh, I apologize. I'm sorry. My memory is totally backwards. I clearly remember the whole story. So here's the reverse of what I just said. She had deeply offended and alienated Carson by taking the job with Fox without informing him in advance. So it wasn't him rejecting her, it was her not waiting for him to give her the job when he eventually decided some 4 years later to finally retire. Okay. Not only was she not asked to replace Carson when he retired, because she thought, well, I'm sure she thought, well, I'll just do this until I get the Johnny Carson job. She was never invited on the Late Show again. Excuse me, on the Tonight Show again. And Carson refused to speak to her for the rest of his life. Subsequent hosts of Fox's Late Show included Arsenio Hall, Suzanne Summers, and Richard Belzer, all crashed and burned. Obviously, Arsenio rebounded pretty well on his own show. And was still up on Celebrity Apprentice 20 years later. Okay. Meanwhile, in April 1987, the network launched a beachhead into prime time with Married with Children, the Tracy Ullman Show, and 3 other sitcoms broadcast on Sunday nights. Rupert Murdoch, our first successful show that showed any ratings was Married with Children, and then came America's Most Wanted. Jim Brooks made a loosely arranged production deal with Fox Broadcasting, which was banking on his Midas touch to make them a hit. He came up with the Tracy Ullman Show, a half-hour variety sketch program that showcased the talents and impeccable mimicry of its British star. Brooks assembled his cabal of Gracie producers and writers. Together they collaborated on what would be Fox's first critical hit. Let's emphasize the word critical, not commercial. The ratings for Ullman never did much. The show is best remembered for launching The Simpsons. Garth Ancier. Basically, I went to Jim and said, look, I know you're a big movie producer now. I know you from, I knew him from before Terms of Endearment. He'd been an executive on Taxi. And he had a movie deal at 20th Century Fox. I went to him literally on bended knee, something I was very used to doing at Fox in the early days. I assume that means because they had to ask for favors for folks that didn't believe in Fox as a TV, production station, setup, thing, entity. And I said, look, is there any way I can entice you back into television? Is there any project that you feel passionately enough about to do it for this startup network? And he said, well, there's one thing with this woman named Tracy Ullman, who I'm kind of intrigued with to do a sketch show. And that's where Tracy Ullman came from. To accompany Tracy's outlandish characters, the producers needed to find a supporting cast that could keep up with the talented performer. Jim Brooks convinced his old friend and Rhoda cast member Julie Kavner, whose spouse was David Davis, the co-creator of Taxi, to join the cast. Kavner, who would eventually provide the voice of Marge Simpson. See where we're going here? See where I'm going back to all this minutia? Accepted on the condition that she would have no contract and hence be free to do other projects, including Woody Allen's movies. For Dan Castellaneta, the future Homer Simpson, producers Tracy Ullman and Heidi Perlman went to Chicago, where they met a casting agent who took them out to see Castellaneta perform at Second City, which is a live improv comedy troupe that is responsible for many generations of Saturday Night Live performers. Tracy loved him immediately. She thought he had the face of a clown. With the producers and talent lined up and the structure of the show in place, all that was left to do was fill in the content. Jim Brooks, Barry Diller, and Tracy Ullman were about to meet the Simpsons family. Okay, pause. Bathroom and beverage, pause time. Sean, let's see. Thank you, Sean. Okay, I'll be back in a sec. Now, next time I do this, I'll work in some music through the mixer. But important thing now is that I've got my Camp Snoopy water glass ready to go. And I'm gonna take a detour right now because I'm sure there's folks that are watching this that are like, when are we going to hear about things that actually happened with The Simpsons? Well, I bookmarked a spot very, very late in this narrative simply because it's the story, it's some anecdotes about one of my favorite, not favorite writers on the show, but personality wise, one of my favorites. um, this is towards the end of the book. So I'm going to just throw this in here as maybe a palate cleanser or a bit of relief from all this TV executive talk and background information. Let's see. This is about John Swartzwelder, one of the most influential writers in the show's history. Is the author of 59 Simpsons scripts. He also left The Simpsons in 2004. Good call. I mean, if you're rich, good call. He now writes novels. Worked in the room only for the show's first few years, appearing on the Fox lot rarely after that to hand in and rework his first drafts. His main role was as the show's premier first draftsman. John Swartzwelder is an enigma. No one I interviewed knows much about the man, and unlike George Meyer, he has never given an interview or spoken publicly about himself or his work. There is not a single Swartzwelder commentary on the Simpsons DVDs as of this moment. They are up to season 12. That's how old this book is. Thank you, Sean. Stick it out with us. Fall asleep while I read you this, Sean. He has written far more Simpsons scripts than anyone else, including such classics as Krusty Gets Canceled, Rosebud, and Bart Gets an Elephant. According to Matt Groening, Swartzwelder used to write his first drafts while sitting in a booth, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes at a coffee shop in the San Fernando Valley. When California outlawed smoking in restaurants, Swartzwelder bought a coffee shop booth, moved it into his house, and began writing from home. In a nod to Swartzwelder's elusiveness, the writers often place his image or his name in episodes. In the early days, the one-armed military surplus store owner, Herman, was modeled on Swartzwelder. Later on, he appeared more randomly, and he had larger hair, a longer mustache, and a bigger belly. Brian Roberts. Swartzwelder, one of the oddest guys ever to walk the planet. Nice, but odd. Even after he was making a pretty decent salary, he still drove a crappy car to work every day. He chain smoked, too. You could always tell Swartzwelder's car because his dashboard was always full of empty cigarette packets and fast food shit and whatever. Brent Forrester. Swartzwelder was incredibly intelligent and just a pure eccentric. I could never have meetings with him in the office because he reeked of smoke so powerfully, even though he wasn't smoking in the office. His just being there meant you couldn't be in there for like 6 hours afterward. You would smell like smoke from the secondhand reek of John Swartzwelder. Daria Paris. There was a rule that you couldn't smoke in Jim's office. When we would have meetings in there, John Swartzwelder, who is a very talented writer, wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't talk without a cigarette. Oh, you didn't go home and take a nap as I thought you were going to, Sean. Brian Roberts. He looks a bit like Mark Twain. Everything that's Civil War in The Simpsons, if you notice there's a big Civil War theme, that's all from John Swartzwelder. Bill Oakley. Swartzwelder is Mr. Simpsons. He's the guy who gave The Simpsons its sense of, like, lunacy. But that's more from his first drafts. Hank Azaria, voice actor on The Simpsons forever. Back in the day, we all used to look forward to John Swartzwelder's scripts. Like, seriously look forward to them. Rob Cohen. Swartzwelder's an enigma. I really like him. He was always incredibly kind to me. He's almost solely responsible for all the itchy and scratchy stuff. I remember he had a really old, weird Datsun B12 with one of the windows made out of plywood. His car was even crappier than my crappy car, which was a 76 Datsun 280Z that had multiple different colored panels on it. So that made me feel good. He was a big, sort of quiet guy. I think he was from Seattle with a mustache and a mysterious brother that nobody'd met. Jake Hogan. I got to know all those guys over the course of 5 years pretty well. And while I never have been invited over to John Schwartzwelder's house, I always used to imagine what it would be like. Stacks of old newspapers, historic newspapers, portraits of people from 1812. One time I remember he bought a picture that Hitler had painted. I was incredulous. Really? You want to buy a Hitler painting? But he loved historical artifacts, and so I imagine he lived with his brother in the valley, and they had old newspapers and historical artifacts. I just pictured it being like, I don't know if you know who the Collier brothers were. They actually died under stacks of old newspapers. That's how I pictured their life in Van Nuys. I will judge you all day long, Sean Gaylord. Brent Forrester. He told us that when he was advertising, it was his goal to expend, oh, when he was in advertising, sorry. It was his goal to spend as much of his money as he could on whatever the newest technology was. So he was one of the first people with a home computer, for example. It was probably enormous and very slow and incredibly expensive, but it was fun for him to have. And, I think he kind of frittered away a lot of his money that way early on. We would have story meetings with him outside, and I remember distinctly one time being a young comedy writer, and Schwartzwelder just happened to be sitting there, smoking a cigarette on the lawn. And I thought, man, I'm just going to ask John Schwartzwelder a random question and see what he says in return. And I said, John, what would you do if you had all the money that you could spend? And without a moment's hesitation, he said, I would buy a battleship and the Empire State Building. With the Empire State Building, I would just let it run down and get decrepit. People would say, you can't do that. That's the Empire State Building. I would say, no, I can. I own the Empire State Building. The battleship, he said, I just think it would change people's conversations with me because they knew I had a battleship. Bill Oakley. The best thing a Schwartzwelder first draft rewritten by is a Schwartzwelder first draft rewritten by people who can sort of bring it down to earth and put in some more emotion. His strength does not lie with emotion. It lies with the jokes that just come out of left field and that no one in history could ever make up other than him. If you look at the Schwartzwelder scripts, it's like he comes from another dimension. He's a genius. His material is so strange, you almost wonder how his brain works. The ultimate Schwartzwelder joke that I still remember appears in the episode Whacking Day. Homer is letting people park on his lawn, and he has a sign that says, parking, $10 per axle. And this foreign guy in his crazy foreign car with like 8 axles drives up, and Homer goes, woohoo! And the foreign man goes, hooray! God, it just makes me laugh. Wallace Wolodarski. Schwartzwelder seemed to go directly from being a homeless person to a writer on The Simpsons. He was a little bit older than us and had, I think, seen a little bit more of the world in terms of being up and down. He did have interesting preoccupations. I know for a while he was collecting wanted posters, real Patty Hearst wanted posters. Brent Forrester. Schwartzwelder, George Meyer, and John Collier were smart about collecting things like R. Crumb stuff before people figured out who R. Crumb was going to be, or Daniel Clowes, or Robert Williams. George Meyer has an incredible Robert Williams collection. The Schwartzwelder Museum would be one of the most fascinating places to hang out. Wallace Wolodarski. He gave me the sage advice once. If you're somewhere and you see something you really want, no matter how much it costs, just buy it, which I follow to this day to great success. Schwartzwelder has not written for the show since 2004. Since then, he's devoted his time to skewering the crime, western, and scientific genres with novellas such as The Time Machine Did It, The Exploding Detective, Dead Men Scare Me Stupid, and How I Conquered Your Planet. Brent Forrester. He was once a great athlete and tried out for a professional baseball team, was what we'd heard. By the time I met him, he was certainly a former athlete, very tall guy, florid red skin, in a way that just bespoke of that kind of unhealthiness diet of exercise regimen. Jennifer Crittenden, writer-producer, The Simpsons. He's truly the most eccentric writer I've ever worked with. He wasn't on staff. We'd only see him when we broke his stories. He always wore the same thing: white, short sleeve, button down shirt, and beige corduroy pants. Whenever he came, we'd get lunch from the apple pan, and he was the only writer allowed to smoke in the room. He told me he got his exercise by running from wherever he was to wherever he needed to go. I guess just sort of integrate random bursts of sweaty cardio into his day. Anyway, when I was on Seinfeld, I pitched that as a Kramer story a few times, actually, and no one ever liked it. They always thought it was too crazy. No one would ever do that. All right, now I'll go back. Doing a very self-indulgent check on things, tech stuff. All right. When Bart met Tracy, I breastfed those little devils. Tracy Ullman. Skipping ahead. Let's see. Garth Ancier, former president of entertainment, Fox Broadcasting. Richard had sent me Max's books because he was excited about the Work is Hell series that Matt had done. We talked about it, and he said, I'd love to do either Binky or some other character from Life is Hell and Work is Hell, etc. And the problem that they had was that the publisher would not allow us to use those characters on a TV show without Matt getting a large percentage of the revenues. So Richard said to Matt, can you go home and draw new characters that we don't have to pay the publisher for? And the story is that Matt went home and came back the next day with, drawn out on a piece of paper, The Simpsons, the family. Phil Roman, former president of Film Roman, animation executive producer, The Simpsons. Matt didn't want to give up Life in Hell. Valerie Kavanaugh, a Gracie Films executive, told me this story. They picked Matt up and they were going to talk to Fox, and they asked him, do you have anything yet? And he said, no. And they said, well, we're having the meeting. So on the way there, he started making some sketches. He created the show on the drive to Fox. Groening has said that he made up the characters while in the waiting area of Brooks's office. So there we go. 3 disparate accounts of the same creation process of those 5 characters, all happening instantaneously for the most part. Regardless of the exact location, the idea that the Simpson family, and like, by the way, this is not like biblical here. This is 1989 or 88 or whatever the hell it is. This is like how there's multiple recipe books about kind of food that Elvis liked, and they have different recipes for how much paprika and flour to put in the fried chicken recipe. Let's see. The fact that it was created before the meeting with Brooks is probably a myth. For some time, Jay Kennedy, Groening's friend and the editor-in-chief of King Features Syndicate, had encouraged him to move away from his rabbits and to draw more marketable human forms. Speaking at Kennedy's funeral in 2007, Groening credited him with helping him develop The Simpsons. While Groening named the family after his own, a father named Homer, a mother named Marge, sisters Lisa and Maggie, he created Homer's middle name, Jay, as an acknowledgement of Jay Kennedy's contribution. Ken Eston. Well, 2, maybe 3 days after I spoke to Richard, Matt sent us a drawing of The Simpsons, exactly as, well, not exactly, almost exactly as they are. Anyhow, everybody said, fine, that's fine. We liked them. And Matt made his deal with Fox. We went into production. And for the first half of the season, we used both cartoons. All of us except Heidi Perlman liked Matt much better, and she continually fought for the woman to be the sole drawer and get rid of Matt. The rest of us wanted Matt, And eventually, Heidi gave in, and we let the woman disappear. I'm not going to go back and find out who that was, but apparently another animation artist, unfortunately, got booted there. Um, more stuff about Tracy Ullman. Oh, Phil Roman. When I was directing the Peanuts specials way back in the late 70s, um, we're talking about a guy named Gabor. Gabor came by. He had just come over from Hungary, showed me his reel he had compiled in Hungary, and I kind of liked him and what he'd done. And I said, okay, I'll give you some work to do, some scenes to animate. I might have given him some of the first work that he did. So that's one of the early Simpsons animators. Let's see. Ken Aston says, Fox gave Matt a much bigger piece than anybody will ever get again because they had no idea. At that point, no sitcom other than MASH had ever been merchandised. And the merchandising for MASH, although far greater for anything else, was still insignificant. So they were just playing hardball with Matt, wanting to merchandise the characters because that's what they do. They screw everybody they can. What they did is give him a much bigger piece than they thought would ever matter. By giving Matt a bigger share of future merchandising, they could pay him less for his cartoons appearing on the show. Now, Matt's probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars because of that. Art Spiegelman, Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist from the graphic novel Mouse, M-A-U-S. Some of you might have heard of it. If you're sort of a comic book geek that knows that stuff from the 80s. I pleaded with Matt and advised him strongly from my elder statesman position to not work with Fox. Whatever you do, don't work with those guys. They're gangsters. They're going to take your rights away, I told him. He's never let me forget it. Oh, yeah, turning Groening's cartoons into an animated show, something Brooks and Company were clueless about, would require an animation studio. They settled on a tiny company in Hollywood called Klasky Ksupo, run by an eccentric Hungarian immigrant, Gabor Ksupo, and his wife, Arlene Klasky, sorry, I backtracked a little bit to get that little setup there. So back to Gabor Ksupo, animation executive producer of The Simpsons from 87 to 92. My partner and I had a small animation studio doing commercials and music videos and all kinds of stuff. We had a call one day from Gracie Film saying, we're looking for an animation company that could animate 1-minute cartoons for a new show for Fox. So we went in there, met the producers, and found out we were one of roughly 200 companies that we're looking at. So we're thinking, we're never going to get this gig. But apparently our reputation was good, and they were telling us, listen, if you guys give us a good bid, the job is yours. So we gave them a price that they thought was pretty reasonable, but they said they actually got a better price from somebody else, which we thought was impossible. When Jim Brooks originally saw Matt Groening's drawings on his wall, it was just a clipping from a magazine, just a line drawing, no color or anything. And that's how he wanted to do the show. And we said, well, it's not going to be very, how can I say it, accessible for people to watch, especially if you want to tell little stories with just line drawings. So we offered them color for the same price. All of a sudden, their eyes lit up, and he said, okay, you guys are on. The characters were so beautiful, but let's face it, primitively designed, so we thought that we could counterbalance that design with shocking colors. That's why we came up with the yellow skin and the blue hair from Marge. We colored it in, and we created the whole look for the show. Even for backgrounds, we used the same kind of flat cell paintings, which no one ever used before. And at that time, we didn't have computers, so everything was done by hand. And I want to mention the fact that, like, those drawings are all, and they're mostly, the early stuff, it's drawn without shading. It's just flat. It's just solid neon colors of the couch or the blue pastel walls and things like that. They didn't create depth. They did it very quickly. They did it in, like, just blanket sort of coloring schemes. There's no little hatch marks to indicate, shading or depth or curvature or anything like that. Margot Pipkin, animation producer of The Simpsons. Klasky Ksupo was a really tiny little place. We had 3 animators in it, Bill Kopp, Wes Archer, and David Silverman, 3 young guys. Everybody was freelance at Klasky because it was so tiny. The only full-time people were Gabor, the receptionist, and Arlene. We hired those 3 guys to animate The Simpsons bumpers, or interstitials, are the names given to the short 1-minute cartoons. Gracie used to fill space between Tracy Ullman's sketches. So they did the layout. They did the animation. They did the in-between. They did everything. And then Georgi Peluche did the color design. Matt, in a recent interview, said he found the colors used for human beings in previous cartoons freakish. So, with The Simpsons, Georgia, Gyorgyi, Peluche chose yellow skin. In the same interview, he noted that she never received proper credit. This could be because, until the date of quotation above, June 07, Matt never gave her any. In all my research for this book, which has spanned 20 years of interviews and feature stories where Matt Groening was quoted, this was the only time he mentioned Ms. Peluche. Georgi Peluche, color designer of The Simpsons. I knew Gabor from Hungary. We worked together at the Hungarian film studio, and when he needed some color design, I did it for him on a freelance basis. I love color a lot. I knew the show was going to be very quick fillers, so I wanted to do something very different, something that was really going to pop, and something that would be a lot of fun. If you look at those drawings, they have a tendency to look like a little crude or primitive, if you will. They're not cartoony. I think they're a category of their own because it didn't look like anything that was done before, and that's why I wanted to give them a color that didn't look like anything else that had ever come before. What is the first thing that comes to people's minds about The Simpsons? Yellow skin and the blue hair. Margot Pipkin, animation producer of The Simpsons. Georgi came up with the colors, and at first everyone balked at it over at Gracie Films. And then Gabor kind of talked them into it, and it was such a funky design. They really needed funky color design too. Gabor liked it. He knew it was good. He knew it was different. He knew there was nothing like it before. Margot Pipkin, again. Georgi brought that crazy coloring style, which Matt would not have chosen on his own. And when he saw it, Matt had the good design sense to say, you know what? That works. Georgi. I've seen The Simpsons movie. It's very nicely done color-wise. But that's not exactly a direction I would have taken with it. It looks a bit too normal, and I like to do weird colors. I had Asian people with slightly green colors at the beginning. I had black people with purplish colors. I don't think it really lasted, but what does it matter what color you are? We are universal. For the voices of Homer and Marge, the producers used Dan Castellaneta and Julie Kavner, actors who were already regulars on the Tracy Ullman Show. Marge's rasp is Kavner's normal voice, almost unaffected. Bonnie Pietila, the Ullman casting director, remembered that Yardley Smith had a funny voice and asked her to read for Bart. Please tune in to my recent podcast episode about Maximum Overdrive. Part 2 is on the way, and we'll talk about some Yardley Smith stuff. Actually, part 1 might not have much about Yardley Smith. Part 2 will, I think. Because she's in that Stephen King movie from 87 with Emilio Estevez. And boy, oh boy, is she a fantastic character actor, tour de force. And you... Let's see. She was asked to read for Bart. When that didn't work out, she tried Lisa on for size, taking her voice up a few octaves. Conversely, Nancy Cartwright was brought in to try for Lisa. When she saw a picture of Bart and a description of his character, she let out a "Whoa, man, yeah!" in a voice that was just a small variation of what she'd done on what Saturday morning cartoon, folks? Does anyone know? The Snorks. Matt Groening instantly said, "That's it. That's him. That's Bart." Hank Azaria was in a play no one was coming to see at the time when Matt and Sam called him to try out for Moe. He used a bad Al Pacino impression. After Azaria made his voice more gravelly, the Simpsons had their Moe and hundreds of other characters that came with Hank Azaria. Harry Shearer came on board because Sam asked him to. Shearer initially balked, and Sam promised it would be only an hour a week. He lied, Shearer has joked. Harry Shearer, you probably know from a lot of Christopher Guest films, most notably Derek Smalls, the bass player for Spinal Tap. The Ullman Bumper episodes were amusing snippets of the dysfunctional family's daily life, focusing mostly on the kids being kids and the grief they cause their parents. Bart and Lisa engage in a burping contest. The parents unintentionally terrify Bart, Lisa, and Maggie with bedtime stories, resulting in loss of sleep for all. Bart directs the pallbearers at a funeral as if he were the foreman on a construction site. Bart tries to catch a football from Homer, and in the process runs into a wall, runs off a cliff, and catches it in his mouth. Then they all go out for frosty chocolate milkshakes. Without a ton of personality, Homer was an angry, moody dad, Marge a traditional doting TV mom, Bart and Lisa were bratty kids who fought and played pretend. The edgy, non-traditional feel of Groening's life in hell had bled into the cartoon spots, with the rampant anti-conservative statement left behind. Another key element to the success. She played the newlywed bride. The newlywed bride in. Oh, are you saying she's Uma Thurman, or she's the corpse bride, or she's a bride from the Newlywed show, the Newlywed Game? Mark Thompson. And are we talking about Julie or Yardley? Let's see. The bumpers were indeed different, but the show's comedy was basic. The Cro-Magnon version of the Simpsons man who would evolve, become civilized, and build empires. Homer, here you can see the DNA of the show's earliest themes. Homer as the grumbling, stumbling father, trying hopelessly to keep his kids in line while not providing much of an example. The parents' well-intentioned behavior toward their kids going awry, Bart's contempt for authority causing havoc, but it's all turning out all right. Or for the better in the end. Yet many of these themes can be found in any sitcom. Going back to Leave It to Beaver, whereas the specific characterization, smart, subversive humor, and tender emotionality that would become hallmarks of the series were, at this point, mostly entirely absent. Oh, Maximum Overdrive. Yes. Yes, Yardley Smith was the new bride. And she yells a lot, and she's great. And and her new husband is pretty funny too, but not nearly as captivating. Okay, here we go. Michael Mendel, post-production supervisor of the Tracy Ullman Show and The Simpsons, 89 to 92 and 94 to 99. Matt would just show up with a 2-page script and go, here it is. This is the cartoon we're doing this week. It was sort of a guerrilla-style animation. We would hang out on the stage of Tracy Ullman in between, we would block, in between block and rehearsal. We would grab the actors and record their lines. It was me and Matt and the animators and a couple directors, a really small group of people working on this 1-minute cartoon every week. Sure. I'm just going to skip ahead. We started putting these 1-minute episodes together on tape, seeing the cartoons play one right after the other in front of a live audience. That's when it dawned on me this was something special. Oh, gotcha. So they start putting them, they start like warming up the audience with like collections of these. Jim Brooks later explained to Charlie Rose that because Tracy Ullman could spend up to 3 hours in makeup, the audience would get incredibly restless. To quell their hostility, the crew would string together a number of Simpsons bumpers, which ended up getting the biggest laughs for an entire show. That doesn't make you happy if you're Tracy Ullman. Another important factor in helping Brooks imagine The Simpsons as its own series was the cheerleading of David Silverman, the director of many of the bumpers, as well as the series' early episodes, and who approached Brooks with the idea at a Christmas party. Although Silverman had been drunk at the time and quite young, Brooks had never had anyone speak to him so passionately about what it would mean for the world of animation to get an animated series on primetime. Meanwhile, back at Fox, some at the studio, headed by John Dolgen, were looking to kill the Simpsons spots because they were costing something like $15,000 per spot and were the lowest testing part of the show. Okay, so let's go back and put those two things together. Like there's a part of the Hip Hop Evolution series of documentaries where they talk about the early days of like rap and hip hop in the 70s in New York. They'd have contests on stage. They'd have like DJs and MCs come out and try out their stuff in front of new audiences and stuff. And the well-established acts would always get a better crowd reaction, and they would win the prize for the night, right? And they were more practiced and more set in their ways, and they knew how to work a crowd. And these would all be recorded off of the mixing desk, and the younger MCs and DJs in combination would come out with their act and get much less of a reaction for a dance party crowd in a big hall or something, or a club, a nightclub, a really dingy place where they could just make a lot of noise all night and wouldn't bother anybody because people had like left New York City in large droves. And what happens is the acts that did the best live and won all the prize money every weekend never went anywhere. And the young guys that actually had better material that the live audience didn't appreciate became like recording artists and hip hop acts in the early 80s that were very successful in New York because they weren't playing to that crowd and just doing things that would make them happy or like throw catchphrases and make them dance or whatever. When you hear it on tape, that doesn't matter. What matters is the songwriting and the execution of it all. I This is barely a parallel to what I'm about to say now, but it just popped into my head. Um, what we're seeing here is sort of the opposite, where you get the ratings numbers are bad for the Simpsons spots, but the Simpsons spots are what are like leading you into or bringing you back from a commercial. So when it fades to black on Tracy Ullman, people are turning it off or turning away and maybe not paying attention to the Simpsons. But in the live audience, the crowds are getting restless and they're getting entertained and laughing out loud at these like strings of cartoons made by the Simpsons crew, and they're laughing at that louder than anything else happening on the actual stage with real people. Let me make sure I'm not getting any weird alerts on my phone telling me that I'm getting a uh-oh. Someone I've never communicated with says, "Hello, how are you doing?" That's not good. That's not good at all. That's probably them being hacked. Elizabeth Murphy. Someone tell Travis's wife, Elizabeth Murphy, that she's been hacked. Um, okay, where are we at? 4:30. Hour and a half in, barely there. Sam Sayonara Simon. The man James L. Brooks chose to partner with Groening in development in this of the series was Sam Simon, a veteran writer-producer who had worked with Brooks on Taxi and Ullman and had written for Cheers. This is why I'm going back into all this stuff. It wasn't just Matt Groening drawing a family and being a brilliant genius. It was hardcore, talented, super weathered, experienced sitcom writers that made this happen. Let's see. Credited by many as the chief architect of The Simpsons, he took the 1 minute shorts from Ullman, transformed them into the hysterical half-hour episodes that America fell in love with. Simon would depart from The Simpsons after its fourth season, leaving behind much acrimony, which Matt Groening, with Matt Groening over creative differences and compensation. That means money. Simon's lawyers negotiated a lucrative deal for him. He left without much severance, but retained a piece of the show, which earns him between 20 and 30 million annually to this day. While many of the early staff, particularly the writers, remain loyal to Simon, calling him an unsung hero, it is clear that Simon was difficult to work with and not an ideal collaborator for Groening, whose reputation as a nice guy and genuinely easygoing person still holds up today. My screen just moved. Why did my screen just move? Okay, we're fine. Simon told 60 Minutes in 2007, "Any show I've ever worked on, it turns me into a monster. I go crazy. I hate myself." For his part, Groening has said, "I think Sam Simon is brilliantly funny and one of the smartest writers I've ever worked with, although unpleasant and mentally unbalanced." Brian Roberts, editor, The Simpsons, 89-92. Sam personally assembled the writing staff. John Swartzwelder, mentioned previously, John Vitti, George Meyer, Jeff Martin, Mike Rice, Al Jean, and eventually Rob Cohen. I think Rob Cohen will go on to help create Futurama as well with Matt Groening. He handpicked Jake Hogan and Wallace Wolodarski, whom he pulled over from the Tracy Ullman Show. So here you have this guy who's personally assembled the equivalent of the Manhattan Project or the 1924 Yankees, as the original Simpsons writer room would come to be regarded by TV writers. The greatest testament to Sam's impact on the show is that even after his departure, that writing team stayed together and continued to pattern the pattern and the template Sam set up. He was a tough guy. He was a critic. If you pitched him something he didn't like, he'd let you know right away. You couldn't have a thin skin. Conan O'Brien, writer-producer of The Simpsons from 91 to 93. I remember Sam coming into the room and pitching to him, and initially being really intimidated. He's hilarious. It was fun to try and make him laugh. If I could make Sam laugh, I was excited. Daria Paris, assistant to Simon. Sam's basically an asshole whom I adore. As crazy as Sam could be, and he could be extremely crazy. He's brilliant. He's one of the funniest people I've ever known. I've found that the staff, the producers, the writers, most of them were very intimidated by Sam, so I wound up being the go-between. They would come to me to talk to him, because there are very few people I'm intimidated by, and I was not intimidated by Sam. I mean, he could be scary. He could have a bad temper. And he could get very passionate about things. And people were afraid to approach him. Wallace Wolodarski, writer-producer of The Simpsons, 89 to 92. Of any of the people on The Simpsons, Sam was the person I was most involved with and learned the most from at that time. He was the person who sat in the room with us day after day. Sam opened our eyes to the possibilities of what an animated show could be, which is to say we could go anywhere in the world, we could do anything, and that was incredibly liberating, coming from live action, because you were obviously limited by so much. More good things about Sam. Sam is said to have actually defined the look of Mr. Burns, Dr. Hibbard, Chief Wiggum, and the cops, and nearly all early characters voiced by guest stars. But in a different way, Simon shaped many, if not all, the citizens of Springfield from the first 4 seasons by developing their characters. For example, Krusty the Clown was inspired by Rusty Nails, a pathetic clown Matt Groening, as a kid, had seen on TV. But Sam turned him into the chain-smoking, hacking, shamelessly self-promoting character who took advantage of kids. Colin A.B.V. Lewis, a supervisor on post-production, says, those first 2 seasons, those first 2 quote-unquote brilliant seasons, that's Sam. Sam put together the models. Footnote, the model is the basic set of drawings that make up a character's physical look. The model for a given character's aesthetic is what animators work from. Sam was the head writer. If you like The Simpsons, you like Sam Simon's work. He was the one who was able to take a sitcom format and make an animated sitcom rather than a cartoon that's adult. That comes from Sam and Jim. The most public airing of ill will between Simon and Groening happened in the pages of the Washington Post just months after the show had debuted. My contribution to the writing of the show should not be minimized, Matt said. I'm involved in every creative aspect, from the conception of ideas to writing scripts and directing voices and designing characters. Sam Simon retorted, he's doing a lot of other stuff for the show, merchandising and things like that. He's the show's ambassador. That's a little bit condescending, Matt shot back. There's definitely a power struggle here, he added. Brian Roberts, I was a big fan of Life in Hell. I read it every other week. And sure, The Simpsons and Life in Hell emulate each other. Life in Hell is funny, but Sam created the biting sarcasm and dysfunctional family. It was based on Matt's thing, but still, it's an awful long ways from taking a 20-second interstitial cartoon on the Tracy Ullman Show and turning it into an actual series that's run for 18 years. So this concept of Matt as the creative driving force behind The Simpsons is just plain bullshit. Jay Kogan, I love Matt as a person. Matt is fantastic. He's funny. He's smart. He's witty. He's pleasant. If anybody I knew was going to become a gazillionaire just for being a nice guy, why not Matt Groening? Wallace Wolodarski. The thing about Matt is that he did supply the template for the show, and that's undeniable. Sam was able to take it that template and make it into an even bigger world and really flesh it out with characters. He brought a broader perspective to it. He made it bigger than just the family. What's such an important part of The Simpsons is the world the characters exist in. Jay Kogan. Matt isn't always in the room, so it's hard to fight with everybody and have a real say if you're not there. He's also a very pleasant, easygoing guy. And the writer's room can be a tough place. But ultimately, Matt got what he wanted. When he pitched stuff, he got what he wanted. Many sources from the early days disagree with this last statement. Creatively, Matt Groening and Sam Simon saw things very differently. The mistrust of institutions and the whimsical cynicism of life in hell would persist in The Simpsons, but Matt was not a TV writer and didn't know how to structure his jokes and concepts into a pithy 22 minutes of television. Sam was a master TV writer and was openly disdainful of Matt's attempts to include himself in the writing process. Creative differences could spill over into budget crises. Scripts being rewritten late in the process are costly, as well as issues of power, control, and credit. Sam and his writers were the ones making the show, but of course, The Simpsons would always be Matt Groening's idea. The differences between the show's two chief developers would devolve into an all-out war, especially as the show gained notoriety and the millions began rolling in. Polly Platt says, Matt did not get along with Sam. Nobody got along with Sam. He's kind of an awful person. If he was at any meeting, it just seemed everyone would turn on each other. Gavin Polone, former agent for Conan O'Brien, Simpsons writer, executive producer on Curb Your Enthusiasm. I remember Sam Simon yelling at me and telling me I was an asshole. I don't remember anybody ever doing that before. He was angry with me because I would try to get my clients as much money as possible. But with Sam, either you do what he wants or you're an asshole. Sam Simon, 1990. I've never worked on a good show where there isn't a certain amount of creative friction. I've seen brother turn against brother in a rewrite room. Brian Roberts. In the beginning, it was all really happy. Everybody ensconced in Marilyn Monroe's old bungalow. That's where Gracie Films was. And it was all very impressive. Jim had a full wall of Academy Awards and a million Emmys. And since the editorial side of the show took place 6 to 8 months ahead of when animation would come back from Korea, for those 6 to 8 months, it was probably the happiest time on The Simpsons. I mean, Matt and Sam were getting along. They were happy. We were recording really funny shows. Just the soundtracks were hysterical. And it seemed as if this little bubble we've been living in for 8 months burst. It didn't burst because of anything negative. It burst because all of a sudden, Bart Simpson became the iconic graphic image of the early 90s. And then the next thing you know, the show ended up on the cover of Newsweek, and that's when it all really started to go sideways. There was a party. I remember it specifically because somebody had created the world's first Simpsons pinball machine. I think Sam and I had had a little too much to drink. Unrelated beverage break. From Triple Horn Brewing Company, the Blonde Ale. Local fellows. We were outside of this party, and Sam was really upset. He was beside himself because Matt was glory hogging the spotlight and taking credit for everything, and Sam didn't get any of that attention. Daria Paris. I didn't like Matt very much. I used to call him cover your children's ears. I used to call him fat fuck Groening because he caused Sam a lot of problems and because I was a Sam supporter in the war. Matt used to go out there and grab all this attention for himself like he did it all. Well, he didn't do it all, And I suppose I felt that was very ungracious and unfair. Colin ABV Lewis. Sam had been around Jim since Taxi, and he went and did Cheers. And so in the TV world, he was pretty high profile to begin with. Jim Brooks is Jim Brooks. Everyone knows Jim Brooks as a director and even on screen from the movies. Matt was the face of The Simpsons. He was the quote-unquote creator. Matt had become a public figure because he's the person whose name was on the show. Matt Groening, he was The Simpsons, everyone thought. He's drawing all the cartoons. He's directing all the episodes. He's writing all the shows. But Sam was the guy no one knew. He didn't have a face. Jay Kogan. Matt Groening got all the credit, or most of the credit. Jim Brooks got some of the credit. Was the credit awarded appropriately? No. But is credit awarded appropriately on any show? Apparently not. I kept reading books about Star Trek where Roddenberry was not the guy who was necessarily at the head of it, or the stuff about The Godfather where it's Coppola and it's a bunch of other people. It turns out that what they say about TV and movies being a collaborative effort is really true. It's a large collaboration, but those are hard stories to tell for the press. They like to make stars out of people. So they pick one guy and say, this guy's the guy who did it. And that's a pretty good story. All right. We are now at an hour. What is it? Is it an hour 35, 36 minutes? That's not bad. There's so much more. So I'm not going to burn myself out. I'm going to pause here. I say pause when I mean probably stop entirely. I want to do more installments of this, but don't want to do it when I've got the sound worked out better. Maybe I'll do it on OBS. Maybe I'll do it on YouTube, and I'll link it in Facebook. We'll see. I think we're at a good spot because we are now ramping up to some more fierce acrimony, which I love. I thank you all for watching as much as you have. I thank everyone for watching this later. I really appreciate it. It'll obviously be in the Facebook archive of my page, but I'm going to transfer it later on to YouTube and figure out something else to do with it. Boy, oh boy, it's 4:38 p.m. on a Saturday Labor Day weekend in Washington State. I hope you are eating good food and being with good people, or resting and sleeping in advance of something else you're going to do tonight. I know there's a lot of bands playing. I know the Delta variant is out there as well. So, I mean, whatever you do here in Seattle, it's not going to be, worse than what's going on in like Florida or Kansas or Texas at large sporting events, I'm sure. But, if you're going to a club or supporting a band, good for you. If you feel safe doing that, all power to you. If you don't feel safe doing that, I totally understand. Stay in. I'm here, not supporting my friends playing shows because I don't want to be alone in my home and make noises in a microphone. And then I'm going to go watch my good buddy Max Pearson make some noises in a microphone on a live stream in a couple of hours after this. Hopefully, you all take care. Mark, up there in Bellingham, have a good night. I'll probably try to pop on and catch you and whoever else is on the call later today. Karen Christopher from either Squim or places further west than Squim right now. If you're out on the lake or at the lake house or in the Squim house, good, happy Saturday to you. And anyone else that's watching this again later, be nice to yourself, crying out loud. Hopefully you are just falling asleep to this instead and having nice dreams about the Simpsons writer's room. We're going to get in the writer's room actually more later. Coming up. I'll promote it, but I'll figure out a different way to do it because I don't like the fact that like last year I would just go live on my page. This year I was doing it in an event, and it confines the video to the event. I'm learning some stuff about how Facebook has changed since last year. And if you have any tips, let me know. Bye. Oh, Chris Caldwell was here. Hello, Chris. Love you and Kim very, very much. And your 70-year-old children that now have graduated from college 25 times or however old they are.